I mentioned a couple of talks ago the connection between Kenneth Frampton and the Institute of Architecture and Urban Studies in New York. Our author today, who wrote this topic, this article on the aesthetics of postmodernism, Ritu Bhatt, she also has a connection, but a little more indirect. She studied under Stanford Anderson at MIT, and Stanford Anderson was part of this triumvirate: Peter Eisenman, Kenneth Frampton, Stanford Anderson, who were the major figures in the Institute of Architecture and Urban Studies. Then Kenneth Frampton really gravitated to having most of his career at Columbia, and most of his theory produced associated with Columbia. Stanford Anderson moved to MIT, established a PhD program in history theory at MIT, and Ritu Bhatt, who is the author of this article, was a part of that program. So she is very much, again, a kind of descendant of this theoretical thinking. And again, Ritu Bhatt was primarily a theorist, is primarily a theorist, and not so much a practicing architect, but very provocative thoughts in this week's reading. I mentioned that Ritu Bhatt came out of this program at MIT in history, theory, and criticism. That probably, for many decades, maybe still, is the best program in the country in terms of history, theory, and criticism. And she's one of those excellent products of that program. So this article that she's writing, I think, has three broad areas that, again, I would like for us to discuss in class. So as you're reading the article, if you could stay aware of these three issues and think about them in particular. And fair game, we can talk about anything in the article in class, but in particular, I'd like for us to focus on these three. And the next talk is going to kind of elaborate on these three areas as well. So the first area is this sort of notion of what is postmodern thinking, and how does postmodern thinking affect architecture and the way we do architecture. And Ritu Bhatt makes the point very firmly that architecture kind of screwed up in its first sort of trial at postmodernism, and it produced a very shallow way of looking at postmodernism. That's not what she's talking about. That's not what she's interested in. Definitely I'm not interested in us discussing that. But more what we're thinking about is the intellectual idea of postmodernism that's there in film, and that's there in literature, and that's there in music, and that's there in politics, and many, many, many aspects of life, and how that might be different from a more classically modern way of thinking in film or literature or politics or architecture. So for a moment here, let's think about what is modern thinking and what is postmodern thinking. And Ritu Bhatt talks some about this, but I think we could expand that productively. So she talks about the difference between modern thinking being more about logic and postmodern thinking being more about emotion. She talks about modern thinking being more about the objective and postmodern thinking being more about the subjective. And I would totally agree with that. But we might make a number of other word pairs. Maybe modern thinking is more about order, and postmodern thinking is more about reality, which is not necessarily ordered. Modern thinking might be more about clarity, clear, strong idea. Postmodern thinking might be messier. It might be more about something that isn't so orderly, but it's quite messy. Modern thinking would be very rational. We're trying to understand and think through and rationally solve this problem. Postmodern thinking might be more political, that there might be positions that enter into this, not just rational decision making. Modern thinking might be more exclusive, Postmodern thinking might be more inclusive. Exclusive meaning I want to focus on just this thing, and I'm not going to think about other things. And postmodern thinking says, no, you can't do that. You have to think about a lot of things at the same time, be more inclusive. Modern thinking might be more epitomized by science and looking for the answer in science. And postmodern thinking might be more about psychology, where there is no answer in psychology. It's a little slipperier. Modern thinking might be seeking the truth, like there is a truth out there. Postmodern thinking is more about belief. Maybe there aren't hard, fast truths. There's what you believe, and that might change. Modern thinking is more about positivism. Postmodern thinking is more about relativism. Modern thinking is more about idealization, the perfect thing. Postmodern thinking is more about skepticism. Nothing's perfect. There are always flaws. Let's understand that as part of the picture too. Modern thinking might be more about the whole, thinking holistically. Postmodern thinking might be more episodic, thinking about just vignettes or pieces. Modern thinking might be more hierarchical. Let's say in a political sense, there are more leaders and sub-leaders and followers, and it's more hierarchical. Postmodern might be more inclusive, more egalitarian. Modern thinking is probably more about looking for facts, and postmodern thinking is more about ethics, what might be the right thing to do in that circumstance, not a fact. Modern thinking might be more about utopia, kind of ideal, we're seeking the big ideal. And postmodern thinking might be more about just everyday life. How do we cope with things day to day? So those word pairs, which we've been flashing up on the screen now and again, are things I'd like for you to think about. And probably in class, I'm going to ask you on a scale of 1 to 10, where 10 is I buy into all of those postmodern words. That's just how I think, how I operate, how I think the world is. And 1 might be modern thinking. You buy into all those words on the modern side of things, and I think that's the way the world is. So 10 would be extreme postmodern thinking. 1 would be more extreme modern thinking. And then there might be a continuum in between, leaning more toward postmodern, more toward modern, right in the middle. But I think I will probably ask you in class, where do you think you lie? What are the things that resonate with you? How do you think the world operates in the 21st century for you? So these word pairs are important to think about, and we'll discuss those in class. A second part of this Ritu Bhatt article is a point she makes about taste and class specificity. So she says that patterns of taste are class specific. She says that she talks about gender responsive space. So is it possible that different classes, different ethnicities, different genders, different political beliefs would make one interpret the physical environment in different ways, so that the aesthetics of the physical environment have some message that is either more or less adaptive to certain subgroups within a larger culture. I'm very keen on this notion in psychology that they refer to as REC identity, racial, ethnic, cultural identity. And especially in recent years, there's been a lot of emphasis on many subgroups within society wanting desperately to have a very strong REC identity, racial, ethnic, and cultural identity. And that then is something they want their world to be responsive to that. And it's entirely possible that physical environment is a part of that responsiveness. The aesthetics of the physical environment might be more or less consonant with the values of one particular group that has a strong REC identity. So an example of that, and you can see that in literature, you can see it in film, or you can see it in music, these very strong REC identities. So someone like James Baldwin, the great black writer in the 40s, 50s, 60s, he concentrated. A lot of what his life was about was honing his REC identity and then using that as a springboard for his writing in novels and in essays and in other media. But it sprung from who he was as a black man and understanding what it is to be a black man, not any human being, but understanding what it is to be a black man, and then how that perspective can be brought to the larger world. Maybe a more contemporary example might be someone like Spike Lee, who as a film director, he's all about his REC identity. He first has to understand the culture, the race, the ethnicity of where I come from, and then I use that as a springboard for making statements about a larger society in my films. So I think that's consistent with what Ritu Bhatt is saying, that patterns of taste are class specific, or maybe race or ethnicity specific, or maybe gender specific. How do those become a way of formulating architectural aesthetics? It's sort of like, these days we're tearing down all these statues of Robert E. Lee because they are offensive. They are, harmful to people with certain REC identities. But how about that country club that looks like a Southern plantation mansion? Seriously? Isn't that the same kind of visual statement that is aimed at ignoring some REC identities? Anyway, we'll talk about that in class, and we'll talk a little in the next talk about that. But how do we deal with differences in race and ethnicity and culture and gender? And then the third thing that I think is really wonderful in this article is that whole segment on everyday life. Should architecture really be about fancy museums and gorgeous performing arts centers and major corporate headquarters? Those are really pretty minor, and maybe in fact we ought to be focused more on everyday life, the place where people live, the place where people work, the place where people recreate, places that form community identity, and how can that be more the focus of what we do in architecture? And that, in that sense, she's looking at Henri Lefebvre, this fantastic French author who wrote this book, Everyday Life in Ancient Rome, where instead of looking at the Pantheon and the Roman Fora, instead he says, where these people live, what were their lives like? Wow, that's a different way of looking at the built environment. Or someone like Jane Jacobs, who brought this sensibility of the everyday life and street in Greenwich Village. That's what's important, not the Chrysler Building or the Empire State Building or Lincoln Center. It's really about everyday life. So again, as you read this article, focus on that, and hopefully we'll have a good, rich discussion on it as well. So in the next talk, we'll look at some examples of these three ideas, and then we'll discuss them in class. See you.